Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I see fathers also and mothers around. I have a few minutes to walk through a project that's much bigger and a project that we have been doing in the past month or so through an intensive desk study, but also some consultations with some groups, some of them here present, others not present. Engagement of the churches in reflection and action on homophobia in Africa, a status report. I think as we gather here today, we are in no doubt as to the predominance of Christianity within our region in Southern Africa. Southern Africa is predominantly Christian, and therefore Christianity is what has brought us here. But also, we're certain that the Christianity that we have in Southern Africa is predominantly conservative on social issues. And that, I think, has to do with the colonial legacy of the region. And therefore, we have Christianity in our region taking a very conservative position on women empowerment, on gender equality, on abortion rights, on LGBTI issues, and so on. But due to this dominant conservative message that's coming from most of our churches, homophobia and transphobia have become one of the major challenges in our region. And because of homophobia and transphobia, many young people, many middle-aged people, many elderly people within our region have become drug addicts. They have taken their own lives. They have been bullied and stigmatized. They have deserted the church. They have been disowned by family, friends, and the church. Ladies and gentlemen, these phobias kill. This presentation is not meant to be a prescription of what we must do, but a suggestion of what we need to consider during this process. I do hope that we will not miss the opportunity presented by this gathering, which is an opportunity to be together, to listen, and to be listened to. A lot has been happening in our churches and amongst LGBTI groups, as well as Christian hetero allies of the LGBTI groups regarding the phobias that we are focusing on in this gathering. What are the strategies that have been used and why? How do we go on from here? Looking at the strategies that have been used to entrench and to sustain homophobia within our region, I have looked at these strategies in two ways. There are those strategies that have been presented by the churches targeting the local community. How do we make our people homophobic? And several of these strategies have been deployed in the region. The use of the Bible as a tool of exclusion, as a battering ram, a functional approach to sexuality, that sex is only there to make babies, even if those churches do not have problems with the use of contraceptives. The use of hyperbole, exaggeration on the threats posed to society by homosexuals, that all homosexuals are pedophiles, that gays want to recruit our children, the threat of secularization. We are, according to Professor Mbiti, a people that are notoriously religious. And our people are told consistently that homosexuality is a threat to their faith because gays are supposedly saying there is no God. But of late, our Christianity has become aggressive in its use of media and technology. Hate messages find their ways to all of our phones through all these social media platforms. And hate messages are getting into all the corners in our communities. And these have been strategies targeted particularly at local communities. And yet, African culture, which is quite interesting, that in as much as our churches think that we should be taken away from our African culture to become Christians, when it comes to LGBTI issues, Christians must become proponents and defenders of African culture. But this particular strategy is not particularly targeted at the local community. This has been our line of defense against the international community. Do not force us to be like you, because we are different. And homosexuality, therefore, is not African. African communities are communal. There are no individual rights in Africa. It is the community rights. And therefore, homosexuality is foreign since it seeks individual rights. And again, in Africa, sex is for making babies. So we have come up with a strategy targeted at defending ourselves from the international community. But then there is another strategy that is worrying. LGBTIs rank very low in our priority of challenges. And this is targeted at both local and international communities. Look, we know that there are issues to do with LGBTIs, but look, there are bigger problems. There are bigger problems. Look, we have to contend with poverty in Africa. We have to contend with unemployment in Africa. HIV, AIDS, cancer, BP, all these are bigger problems. Don't worry, we will get there at some point. And because of these strategies, our region is infested with homophobia and transphobia. And churches in our region have been responsible for a lot of deaths in this region. We are here remembering also Eunice Melan and the way a life full of promise was snatched away because some people hated and some people refused to see the image of God where it was very clear. But the beauty about this discussion and this congregation is that people have not taken silently to this message of death that has largely been engineered within our churches. The Church of Jesus Christ becoming the missioner of death. I think that's a paradox. The victims of homophobia and those sympathetic to them and their allies have not been silent in the face of these concerted attacks from the church and her allies. They have also come up with strategies to fight back and to resist. And similarly, the strategies have also targeted local communities as well as the international community. Particularly targeting at the international community because it is critical in a globalized village that we have allies who can also fight our battles. The universalization of sexual rights under the human rights discourse has done wonders in terms of linking LGBTI groups within the region and on the continent with LGBTI groups internationally. Because we deal with human rights as a universal subject. And this has helped particularly in the quest to fight for legal protections. Human rights have presented an opportunity through which LGBTI groups can push for legal acceptance. But then there is also within still that focus on human rights an attempt at reconciling human rights and religious beliefs. That is an initiative that is set to reconcile the international and the local communities. Both communities, the international community and the local community, have tended to look at human rights and religious beliefs as mutually exclusive. The hope is to make them mutually inclusive, thereby widening the scope of collaboration between allies across the artificial divide of human rights and religious beliefs. The majority of initiatives, however, have been targeted at local communities because the greatest desire by LGBTI persons that I've worked with, that I have researched on, and their allies, is not simply to have legal acceptance, legal protections. It is to be accepted within the communities within which they live. That is the greatest gift LGBTIs are asking for. And because of that, strategies have been devised to target the local community within which LGBTIs live, because that is what their desire is all about. To go out there and have the same rights on the street, the same rights in the church, the same rights in the home, the same rights everywhere they go. And because of that, and realizing how the Bible is critical in our region, LGBTIs and their allies have resorted also to using the Bible, but they've gone further than the church because the church has decided to live only in the text of the Bible, but LGBTIs have gone beyond simply living in the Bible and appropriating the central principles of the Christian gospel. The greatest commandments we already have heard from the panel that came just before me, that the greatest commandments according to Jesus is to love God with all you have and then to love your neighbor. Love has become a critical part of the message that is central to the LGBTI movement. The gospel is life-giving and not life-snatching, and Jesus has always found comfort on the margins. Organizing seminars and workshops with church leaders has been another of those strategies that have gradually changed people. We have seen people who said, before I attended that seminar, I never understood any of these things. But today, I thank God, I have seen the light. But it's not always like that we adopt non-confrontational approaches, because indeed, fighting fire with fire has become also a principle that has been adopted. Because one of the key arguments that has been raised by most churches is that homosexuality is not African. But is homosexuality not more African than the Bible? Indeed. Is homosexuality not more African than the Bible? So, fire has been used to fight fire. But another strategy that has been used is creating and widening of strategic partnerships with hetero allies. And I am so happy that we gather here not only as LGBTIs, but not only as Christian hetero allies, but as all of us. These partnerships are a critical dimension in the long-term survival of this quest and its eventual success. Creating support groups for families and friends of LGBTIs, and I am particularly happy when Gerald said to me, the Simelane family is with us. I said, thank God, this is happening. Scholars in churches and in politics, all these are areas where we need to begin to put our partnerships into place. And how beautiful it is that I'm actually standing in a Christian seminar and saying this. Thank you. But we also need to ride on existing structures and platforms. There are so many platforms that are already in place that we need to ride on. That has been another of the strategies. The production and dissemination of information is a critical need. For a long time, we have survived on translating materials, Now is the time to aggressively produce the materials. Cross-border linkages. I am particularly impressed because I've worked with groups, LGBTI groups that are collaborating across the borders within the region. We are not simply collaborating with people in the West or in the North. We are collaborating as brothers amongst ourselves. And that gives me a lot of hope on the strength of what we are doing. Now, as we look at the next 2 days in which we are here discussing, what issues are we going to focus on? I do hope that our dialogue will expand and deepen talks around these and other strategies that I will come up with, so that we come up with new and sustainable approaches to combating homophobia. And I have here 3 areas that I suggest that we particularly focus on: reconciling sexual rights, Christianity or religion in general, and human rights. This is particularly important because the more human rights language we use in our region, the more distant we look from the church. Where do we get our human rights from if it is not from the image of God that you and I possess? Let's find a way of developing a theology that reconciles these seemingly exclusive areas. Reclaim Christianity through an aggressive proclamation of the central teachings of the gospel. The history of Christianity is a history of Christianity going wrong. But it is also a history of some Christians standing up for the right path. Unpopular, a minority, but eventually successful. South Africa is not too far away from realizing that. The Kairos theologians made a difference, and today we celebrate them. A few months ago, we were in Ghana, where people were worshiping on top of a dungeon that held slaves. But through the work of those Christians who said, Christ cannot be in this chapel as long as there are slaves down there, we celebrate the success of what Christianity can do in our lives. How do we develop a theology of sexuality, a theology of humanness that brings and reconciles religion, sexuality, human rights, and the Christian faith? I think this is one of those areas that we need to really focus on. But we need to pursue an aggressive research and information dissemination policy within our region. And I am happy that South Africa is doing well, that I'm not really bragging, but I think that Zimbabwe has come on board. We have started seeing quite a number of scholars within Zimbabwe who are saying, look, my conscience is much more important to me than my self-preservation. I will speak what I am convinced is right. And ladies and gentlemen, before I sit down, let me invite all of us today, as we begin these 2 days of discussion, reflection, and dialogue, that let us all become women. During these 2 days, let us all become women. Now, thank you for laughing. I thought somebody is not hearing me. But let us all become women. Why? Because we think that, and we have been talking about this in other circles. If this world is going to have peace, there has to be a clear difference between women and men. So how do we get peace in this world? Men must begin to talk about the big issues. Since we're sitting here, men should start be asking, should Donald Trump become the American president? Or we should be talking about whether Pep Guardiola must move to Manchester City. We could also even think in terms of whether that book of Hitler should have been now made public and so on. Those are big issues. But we could also delve a bit into history and say, should George Bush have attacked Iraq? and so on. Those are big issues. And then women must confine themselves to small issues, such as, where do we send our child to school? What do we eat in this house today? What kind of color should we paint our house? Small issues, right? But the important thing, and this is why we want to become women and not men. Men talk about issues they have no control whatsoever on. But women deal with issues they influence, things that can actually change tomorrow, because that's what they deal with. The practical issues, the issues that help us to change ourselves and those around us. So, once again, I want to invite all of us to become women for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Where people argue that there are certain matters that can be postponed, those at the receiving end say, if you have time, good for you, but we don't have the time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the opportunity we have to dialogue with Masiwa on the paper that he has presented. What are our feelings and sentiments and reflections? We have about 10 minutes for that. We have a roving mic. Please raise your hand if you have any quick thoughts and comments on the presentation that has been given to us. Yes, please, yeah.
Phansi homophobia, phansi. Phansi homophobia, phansi. Good morning. My name is Virginia Magwaza. I work for an organization called Foundation for Human Rights, but I also work in an initiative called the Parents, Families, Friends of the South African Queer. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm glad you are all women today. I think the point that you raised that touched me was, in a way, the role that the churches are playing in perpetuating homophobia and hate crime. Even if it's not direct, it's actually very huge. Because I'm thinking that even if people don't go to church, they do pray. And they take the church very serious. And everything that the church says is going. Even if you get to a tavern, when people get drunk, they start singing church songs. Because the church is very powerful. It is a powerful instrument or institution in our society. So when things like homosexuals are demonic and come from the church, I think as church members or church leaders or pastors, we need to understand that that has a huge impact on how homophobia is perpetuated. And also with regard to parents who go to church and also pushes their children to go to church. When a child comes out to her parent and say, I'm a lesbian, as I'm working in this initiative, the first question they ask me, they'll be like, did you read the Bible for this child that is telling me that she is lesbian? So I think this dialogue is important in such a way that the initiatives that we are taking can be very enhanced when the language at the churches begin to change.
Thank you very much for the comment and observation. Anyone else in the house with a comment, observation? Yes, Pumzile there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rahis, for challenging us. I really enjoyed your paper until the point where you started talking about women. Some of the statements you made were a bit problematic for some of us. Yeah, but it's your opinion. My question is, one of the things you said was the Bible. No, homosexuality is more African than the Bible. I hope that's what you said, or maybe that's my understanding of what you were saying. My question is, have we identified any specific principles that come from traditional society that can be used to actually counteract some of the practices that have been justified by the use of the sacred text.
Thank you. One more, and then we'll ask Masiwa to respond. I don't think, okay, yes.
Thank you, Masiwa, for the reflections. I might have misheard you or didn't quite grasp it. You talked about a lot of community-based local strategies and approaches, and you talked a bit about research. I'm not sure whether you are saying those are the best approaches, are the spaces for engagements around macro processes and systems and other factors that perpetuate homophobia, and other examples of those. No, I said you talked a lot about strategies that involve mobilizing communities that churches are in many ways increasingly adopting. Are there examples, I mean, in your own findings of what I could call macro strategies that involves looking at the main thing, bigger pictures?
Okay, one more. Yeah, because the others were comments.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for a very enlightening intervention. I just wanted to ask the question around whether you think there is any correlation between churches that are more inclusive of women or recognize the potential roles of women, not just as members, lay members of church, but in the hierarchy of church, whether there's any correlation in terms of how you see they open the space for accepting people of different sexual diversity. I think that there's a real problem, and whether to begin to connect all this exclusiveness or exclusive practices in the church, whether it's about poor people, women, people with all kinds of markers, and so the church has a broader role to play in terms of inclusiveness, and how then the church brings strategies together which opens the space for greater acceptance of everyone. You know.
The first contribution for the comment, I don't think there is any need to respond to that. It was a straight comment. I'm sorry if what I said about women was a bit in bad taste. I did that, I think, with all honesty and thinking it wasn't in bad taste, but I hear you. And then on specific traditional principles to use, if the Bible is an African, I think the idea is not that we want to disown the Bible, because then we lose the battle. We want to appropriate the Bible. But we also want the church to realize that a lot of the things that we call African today are actually of foreign origins. And yet there are certain things that we are proclaiming as foreign that have actually always been with us. So I think that's the context in which this argument is being made. But we do not want to get rid of the Bible, because we want to use the Bible. It already has a lot of social capital within our region, and we want to tap into that. But on those traditional principles, I think there is an attempt to look at concepts like Ubuntu. And that's why also now you're getting more and more people arguing that if there's anything that has been imported into Africa, it is homophobia. That traditionally, it appears that our systems did not have room for homophobic statements and fears and so on, because the society itself had its own ways of dealing with those that were different. Some of them celebrated, others given roles and so on. So I think that's an area that is beginning to get a lot of research attention. And then on the strategies that mobilize communities, what I did in my presentation was to study what was happening on the ground. And then what I said at the end was areas that I thought we could invest much more attention, try and therefore develop macro strategies from the research and publications output, from coming up with a Christian that we think is the right Christian, that affirms all people because they have an image of God. And so the strategies that I was outlining are strategies that are already being used throughout the region in different ways with different emphasis. And what I then suggested as areas that we could focus on, those I think are areas that present us with the greatest opportunities moving forward. And then the correlation between churches open to women and their openness to LGBTI persons. That's quite interesting and vexing. You would think that churches that are open to women naturally would be open to LGBTI, but that's not always the case, because there are churches that have become much more tolerant. If you look at the Pentecostal movement, for instance, which is one of the manifestations of Christianity in our region, it is a movement, I think, that has accepted women so much. But it is also the movement that's the worst enemy of the LGBTI community as we speak. So it is not consistent that those that are open, or those that have always been within the liberation dimension, have gone on to continue with that same dimension when it comes to LGBTI persons. So they moved into liberation when they needed to support the political move towards independence, and then reverted to social conservatism when it came to LGBTI issues. I hope that's.
Thank you very much. I was tempted to close the discussion now, but I see two hands I cannot ignore. Please, there are colleagues there.
Thank you. I just want to say something that we have to understand as LGBT communities. The biggest weapon of the oppressor is not to look you in the face. So as long as we continue running away from the church, we are giving them power. Tell them it's God's church. I belong in this church. I'm not going nowhere, and I'm not going to make an apology. Let them run away from the church themselves, because that's how it has worked. They make you invisible. And until we reclaim the place in the church, the oppressor will always say, we don't even have gays in Africa. You know, it's like Mugabe saying, oh, this is an African, but he's using a fork and a knife when he's being interviewed by CNN. What is African about that? So please, my plea is this, as a minister, tell every pastor, we are here to stay. If you don't like it, go to your father's church. This is my father's church too, period.
Thank you very much, and thank you for commenting on my president.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Regis, for your presentation. I think I want to pick up on Phumzile's comment and discomfort, which many of us shared about the last comment about women, and explain that a little bit. Because I think a number of us recognize that a key strategy in dealing with homophobia, particularly transphobia, sexism, etc., involves breaking down essentialist ideas of what it means to be a man and a woman, right? And so the idea that the call to be women puts us back into that box. And I think that, but my question then is, if based on the status report that you presented on what's happening on the ground, is what is actually happening on the ground with regard to not just this theology of compassion that's going around. So, you know, we need to listen to people's stories and of exclusion and fear, etc. But what is actually happening on the ground in terms of breaking down those essentialist ideas, which are found in religion, which are found in culture, of what it means to be a man and a woman. I think there's growing recognition that even the nomenclature LGBTI is only functional, right? That it doesn't capture the fluidity of gender, it doesn't capture the fluidity of gender identity and sexual orientation in particular. So have we moved to that second level? Because I think the first level is that theology of compassion that we keep hearing about. But are we moving to the next level?
Thank you. My name is David Kuria. I just want to continue with the same thought line. I just want to ask from your status report whether you have encountered any of the churches or movements that are proactive in reaching out to the LGBTI communities. Most of those accepting communities would be the places where people have said, this is my church, I'm not going anywhere. In essence, fighting for their spaces within the church. But I could be wrong, I stand to be corrected on this, but I think the nature of the church is to reach out to communities. So I'm wondering whether there are any such movements of their own volition, really, to reach out to these communities without having for people to struggle and fight for spaces.
Thank you. I will not say much, I think, on what Sarojin was saying. It's an area, I think, that we need to look at seriously and look how we can move to that next stage. But I'm really grateful that you're raising that point. And then coming to the last contributor, are there churches that are going out to reach out to the LGBTI communities? Within the South African community, you could point to one or two denominations that have become of late proactive. But outside of South Africa, within the region, that's not happening. And from my research, it appears that the way the subject of homosexuality came into the public domain is one of the reasons why, or that churches use to hide in order to mask the reason or the fact that they are not reaching out as they should, which is, for instance, in Zimbabwe, homosexuality comes into the public domain as an election issue, a political election issue. It's raised within an election cycle. And so any attempt at doing anything different from what is politically correct is interpreted as challenging the political system. And churches in Zimbabwe are quite afraid of doing that. And I think that's also that has become now part of the strategy within the region, that homosexuality is much more of a political issue. Because in Zimbabwe, it is interesting that in as much as people know President Mugabe as one of the worst sponsors of homophobia in the world, he still allows gays and lesbians of Zimbabwe to have an office 500 meters away from a police station. Because it's a political game. He needs them in the public domain because he uses them for political purposes. If they go underground, they will not become the tool that they currently are. And so I think that's part of complicating what the church is doing. And so the church is hiding behind it. If I go public and say he is wrong, then I'm in trouble with the politics and so on. So outside of South Africa, there isn't much reaching out that's happening from the churches. But I think within South Africa, again, there's a reaching out and there's a reaching back in a way. I think we're aware of developments we were sharing with a colleague within, the Dutch Reformed Church, where steps have been made forward, but steps have been made backwards as well. So I think these are things that are ongoing and not particularly straightforward. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we put our hands together again for this session? What is left for me now is to invite the next panel to please come up front. Jane, Ecclesia, Steve, and Douglas.